How do you actually buy property here in Puerto Vallarta? This is a question that I get quite often, and because of that, I want to shoot this video so that I can break down the simple process of how you actually go about buying property in Puerto Vallarta. And before I get into that, be sure to download my free Puerto Vallarta Buyer's Guide. All you gotta do is send me a quick message with the word guide, and I'll send you a copy right away. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the process. Now in this video, I'm going to break down the simple 4-step process that it takes to buy property in Puerto Vallarta. I'll go over the time frame of how long it actually takes to close on the property. We'll go over buying property as a foreigner. We'll touch on financing options, closing costs, and what documentations you will actually need. Now most of my experience comes from being a real estate agent in Southern Utah for about 20 years. So I'm going to use that as a sort of reference point to kind of compare the process so you have a better idea of how it actually works here in Puerto Vallarta. So the very first step is going to be the offer. Okay, so once you find the property that you're interested in, that you like, then we're going to put everything on an official and initial offer. This is where we're going to outline the price, the conditions, and the closing time frame. The seller usually has about 48 hours to respond. And then once we have an accepted offer, then we'll begin the due diligence process. Now this is where it can be different from the States. Usually in the States, once you make an offer and it's accepted, then you have 4 days to turn in a deposit, and then you can begin your due diligence process. Here in Puerto Vallarta, you do due diligence first, and then once you are completely satisfied with your inspections and your research, then you make your deposit. During the due diligence process, you have the right to do inspections. You review any documentations with the HOA if there is one. You do any kind of research you want to do on the property. And the notary also reviews the paperwork on the deed to make sure that it is a good deed. So now to kind of recap so far, we have the first step is to make the offer. The second step is to do due diligence. And the third step is to make the deposit. The deposit is going to be held by an escrow company. Now I don't recommend just any old escrow company. I work with a certain one that is based out of the States. It is regulated by US government. So this adds an extra layer of security for my clients. The deposit is usually 10% of the purchase price. Now keep in mind that here in Mexico, we don't work with title agents. There is no such thing as title companies and title agents. Everything is done through a notary. Now notaries here in Mexico are not like notaries in the States, where all they do is verify identities. Here in Mexico, notaries have to take extensive education and they have to pass the equivalent of a bar exam. So notaries here are the equivalent of attorneys. They work with legal paperwork and they are the ones that are responsible to transfer title from one person to the next person. Once the deposit has been acknowledged, then the notary will begin to draw up the paperwork to prepare the new deed for the new buyer. Now, the fourth step is the last, which is to sign paperwork. Now, in the States, usually the buyer and the seller have their own title companies and their own title agents. Here in Puerto Vallarta, we usually work with just one notary. Both the buyer and the seller come to the closing table together. They sign paperwork right then and there, and the new buyer walks away with the keys right out of the closing table. Now keep in mind that your new title can take 3 to 6 months to receive. However, once you leave the closing table, you will have legal paperwork showing that you are the new owner. Okay, so what about time frame? How long does it actually take from the initial offer to when you get keys? Here in Mexico, a closing can take anywhere between 45 to 60 days. Now, if there's a holiday somewhere in between, which there are a lot of holidays here in Mexico, it may be longer. What about foreigners? Can they actually legally own property in Mexico? Again, this is another topic that comes up quite a bit. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet. There's a big myth that foreigners have to sign some kind of a lease for like 100 years. That's not the case. Foreigners can legally own property here in Mexico. There used to be a restriction where foreigners couldn't own property that were near the border or near the beach, but that has changed. So foreigners can legally own property that is near the border or near the beach. It's usually done through a trust, meaning that a bank will actually hold the deed in a trust which you control, which you manage. This trust is renewed every 50 years in perpetuity, and it's usually about $1,500 to set up, USD and about 500 per year USD to maintain. This gives you full rights to the property, full ownership. You can rent it out, you can live in it, you can profit from it, you can pass it down to family. Anything that a national can do, you can do as a foreigner through this trust. Now, what about financing options? This is another question that I get quite often. And just to give you a rough idea, about 85% of all purchases here in Puerto Vallarta are bought either cash, or most buyers will get a HELOC loan from their bank because the terms and the interest rates tend to be quite favorable compared to getting a mortgage with a Mexican bank. So there are options to get a mortgage through a Mexican bank. There are certain lenders that will originate loans for both Canadians and Americans. Keep in mind, they're not the easiest things to get. You'll typically need about 20 to 30% down payment. Interest rates are usually between 9 to 12%, and typically they're between 10 to 15 years only. There's no 30-year mortgages here. And again, they're not the easiest things to get, and they can usually take several months to actually close. Now, what about closing costs? Closing costs here in Mexico do tend to be higher than that in the States. We're talking 4 to 6%. There are a couple of variables that will dictate exactly how much the closing costs are going to be. As an example, I recently helped a family purchase a property here in Conchas Chinas. The property was for 863,000 USD, and the buyers were fully prepared to pay 50,000 in closing costs. However, once we were under contract, they received a closing cost estimate from the notary, and it showed that it was going to be closer to 32,000. However, once we got to the closing table, they were refunded $2,000 back. So they ended up paying closer to 30,000 in closing costs. So the 4 to 6% is just a rough estimate. We'll have a better idea on what the closing costs are going to be once we get the closing cost estimate from the notary. This is going to include taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, escrow fees, notary fees, etc., and whether or not you'll need to set up a trust. Now, let's talk about the documentations you will actually need. First of all, you're going to need 2 forms of ID. You'll need a marriage certificate if you're married. You'll need a proof of address, and this has to be some kind of a utility bill. And you're going to need some KYCs, or Know Your Clients forms. This has to do with a new anti-lavado law that kicked in last year here in Mexico. It's an anti-money laundering law that kicked in. They want to know who the person is. They want to know whether they work or not, where the funds are coming from to purchase this property, and etc. So there you have it. This is a general overview of the process of buying property here in Puerto Vallarta. Now, every transaction is going to be quite unique. Not all transactions are the same. There's a lot of variables that can come into play that will kind of change the transaction just a little bit. And so this is why it's very important that before you dive in, before you decide to make that purchase, that you work with a knowledgeable real estate agent who knows what they're doing, who knows the process, that can walk you through each step, that will make everything as smoothly as possible. So if you want to know more about buying property here in Puerto Vallarta, then send me a message. I will leave all my contact info in the description. And I look forward to hearing from you and helping you on finding your own piece of paradise. Talk to you soon.